Welcome to Lecture for Research Methods, Dr. Fiala. I'll be talking today about research designs that are designed with the goal of discovering or identifying cause and effect relationships, but for a variety of reasons don't quite meet the standards of experimental research. And we'll be focusing on single-end designs, also referred to as single participant designs, and different types of quasi-experimental designs. So why look at these alternatives if in fact experimental designs are the gold standard for examining cause-effect relationships? Why look at anything else? Well, it could be that you're in a particular phase of research in an area of interest that's more exploratory in nature. Often these not quite experimental designs are easier in terms of the cost of doing them, the number of hours required, the number of people required to be involved. And so if you're just starting to figure out, well, I want to identify if maybe there's some sort of cause and effect relationship here, maybe you use one of these designs. Whereas when you become more confident and now you're looking to confirm a strongly suspected causal influence, then that's when you go to your experimental design, where you take all the time and effort and energy to meet all those requirements. Another reason is to help address something that's been discussed in the literature a bit the past decade or two, and that's the researcher-clinician divide. And that's just this idea that there seems to be this gap between the questions that researchers ask, how they ask them, the data they generate, and the kind of questions that clinicians are typically interested in. And the two parties tend not to be the same people, so there's not physical overlap, and partly because of that, there's this gap where clinicians say, oh, the research is it's all done, it's in too artificial of settings, these experiments where they select out, all their participants can't have any comorbid diagnoses, and that's not what my client base looks like, and therefore their research is meaningless to me because it's done in this lab with this very select sample that's not generalizable to the real world. And then the researchers, on the other hand, saying, well, you clinicians want to know this stuff, but if we really want to study it scientifically, we have to have all these controls. Well, that's where these kind of quasi-experimental designs can come in, and it's maybe a middle ground between the two, where you still exert as much experimental control as possible, but then you cede some of that control and some of the things often required for an experiment in order to do some more real-world application of the scientific method to look at problems that clinicians would be interested in terms of how can I help these clients doing this thing that I'm doing, rather than some sort of ivory tower process that you're looking at. Speaking of process, if you have your question is about process, about how some causal agent happens. Often that's going to be more effectively looked at in a non-experimental designs, because experimental designs typically, not always, but typically you're looking at one group versus another group, and you're looking at some mean difference. Did this group differ from this one? And that's a very yes-no type of thing. Whereas with a lot of different quasi-experimental designs, you can look at things over multiple points in time and multiple variables at once, and that allows you to look at how something is changing, not just yes it changed, no it didn't, right? So how did it become different when we have this level of an independent variable versus this other level of an independent variable? And last, whenever you have dual goals of research and intervention, so those cases where you do have someone who is an interventionist, a clinician, working with people, but wants to document the effectiveness of her work or his work, then oftentimes those individuals will turn to your quasi-experimental designs, single-end designs, so where they're being methodical about data collection, but again, not doing something in a kind of a laboratory university setting, more real world. Single participant designs, also referred to as single-in designs, can be especially relevant for people doing clinical work. Even if you have no interest in publishing your research, you can still do research in terms of scientifically evaluating whether or not what you're doing is working and what it is that you're doing that's working. Single participant designs are great for that. And one kind of key thing to touch on at the beginning is not necessarily n equals 1. So not necessarily single participant. That's just the name used to talk about these designs. Often it's a single participant. Sometimes it's more than one. Could be a handful, could be a dozen. One of the reasons we don't call it dozen participant design or small number of participants design is because the level of analysis you look at is at each participant. So even if you had 12 people that you were looking at, you would look at each person's progress over time, or each person's difference before you did something to after you did something at an individual level. You're not looking at some sort of group average, which is very different than a lot of other research. So the level of analysis is at the level of n equals 1, even if you have more than one person in the study. So a long history of single participant designs in psychological science. Remembering back to Ebbinghaus's studies of memory, where we identified that kind of forgetting curve, right, where Ebbinghaus taught himself these nonsense combinations of letters, and then tested himself repeatedly to figure out, okay, when will I forget these things that I've learned? And he used himself as a participant, but didn't get a bunch of people, just used himself. Say, well, gee, that's not very good research. Well, it does have its problems, but nonetheless incredibly influential in the field of cognitive science. Right? B.F. Skinner, a lot of his work was single participant designs, looking at, okay, when this rat is learning to run this maze, right? He didn't get 50 rats, he'd get maybe 3 rats, but he was looking at them at an individual level. So a lot of very useful information in our field has come from these types of designs. What do they look like? Well, the key features include repeated measures of the dependent variable. So it's not going to be just measuring the DV once, not even just twice, not just pre-post. It's going to be multiple times of measuring some dependent variable or variables. And typically you'll have, we think in terms of phases, right? So you have, instead of pre-test, you think of a baseline phase. So before we do anything to the participant, we're going to establish a baseline. And we do that not by measuring, so let's say we're looking at a kid that's doing some self-harm head banging, right? So we're going to see, okay, on this day, how many times did he bang his head against the wall and required, staff to intervene? And in some designs, say, okay, well, that's a pretest. Well, in single n, partly because we're looking at just at a very small n, it allows us to do more than just measure once. It also, in many ways, requires us to do more. Because we have this flexibility granted us by having only one participant to deal with, we now have the time to do much more than that. And also, you have the responsibility to do that, because with just one person, if you're going to try to generalize beyond that, you want to be very clear that this one day when this kid was headbanging a lot, that wasn't an aberration. It just happened to be a high day, and the next week it was all low. Nothing to do with what you did, just it was a high day, right? So you have to establish a baseline. So you do multiple measurements, at least 3, generally, points in time. So you get three days in a row, or 3 measurements all 2 days apart. Lots of different ways to do it, but getting some baseline where we say, okay, and we're going to keep measuring until we see a stable baseline, right? If it's we say we have these 3 days we're measuring. If it's low, high, low, okay, I'm going to keep measuring because I don't know if there's a pattern yet. If it's low, high, low, 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 high, low, high, low, high, low, okay, I see a pattern. There's this oscillating pattern, maybe this sine wave, right? Even though it's going up and down, it's stable. Now I can look at an intervention and see what happens next. Or if it's High, 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 that's a pattern. Low, 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 that's a pattern. If it's low, medium, high, okay, that's a pattern. It's increasing, right? As long as there's some trend and I can see a pattern, now I've got a baseline. Once I've got my baseline phase established, we can introduce some treatment, right? So you're going to introduce, you're going to manipulate an independent variable. You're going to do something different to this person. So maybe with this kid who's headbanging, we introduce some sort of token economy where we reward him for every time that he goes 15 minutes without headbanging, he gets a token. End of the day, turns in his tokens for some prize, some free time, whatever it is. Okay, so we start doing that after the fourth day of observation. Right, we've established a baseline. Start doing that, and now we're gonna measure a treatment phase. And again, it's not simply you started doing it. We'll wait a while and then measure once. No, we're gonna measure, 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 measure to see what's the trend that's happening. So was the head banging high, high, high? Would introduce the thing, and now it's low, low, low. Great, then it worked. Could have been it was high, 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 and then when we introduced the thing, it was high, medium, low. Okay, it decreased. Great. Could have been high, high, high. Introduce treatment, high, low, high, high, high. Okay, maybe it started to work and then stopped working. Right? But I can get a pretty clear idea of the effectiveness of my treatment by taking multiple measurements. And again, one of the key things is to look for stability within a phase. And that stability can be something's level, so it's not changing, or there's some trend where it's trending upward, trending downward, or even possibly that kind of sine wave where it's up, down, up, down, up, down, but in a predictable way. Not really high, a little bit low, a little bit high, really low, really, but you know what I mean, predictable. So with this method, again, you're using repeated measures, and another feature is that participants serve as their own controls. So even if I had, say, two kids who were doing headbanging, I wouldn't necessarily, do the thing with one kid, but not with the other. No, I'm not going to compare this kid to that kid. I'm going to compare each kid to his or her own self. So kind of a within subjects way of looking at things, right? And one thing that is allowed for potentially with a single in design is experimental replication within the design. Right? In most of the studies we look at, we're going to get a pre-test, we'll do something, post-test, are they different? Okay, we found this difference. Now let's see if somebody else can go and replicate it with another group of people, which is good, which is appropriate. But one cool thing you can do with single participant designs is replication within your own study. So with this kid, we do the baseline phase, right? We introduce our intervention. Maybe the headbanging reduces dramatically. Hey, great. Okay, let's see. We take away the token economy because we want to see if that's really what changed it, or maybe it was something else. Only way to know is to take it away. So we take away the token economy, and then we measure, measure, measure. The headbanging goes back up. Oh, geez, I guess it was working. But we don't just stop there. We introduce the intervention. We go back to the token economy. We measure, measure, measure. Headbanging came back down. Okay, we just replicated the finding within that participant, right? Behavior was high. We did something. Behavior dropped. We took away the thing we did. Behavior went back up. Put the thing back. Behavior comes back down, right? Replication within one study. Very cool thing. Another thing that I think many of you may like about this type of design is the method of data analysis is often visual analysis of data. So you're not really using inferential statistics very often with single participant designs. You really are just graphing. Okay, in this example, we've got baseline and then treatment, and then we take away treatment A, which also can be referred to as extinction A, establishing a new baseline. And so we say, oh, it was low, then it went high, then it was low again. And it's not, oh, well, is it high? Is that difference between low and high enough to be statistically significant? I don't know. You're not worried about statistical significance here. You're really looking at visually when you look at it. Does it make sense that that much difference is important? So there's a bit more maybe subjectivity in interpretation of data here. But you're probably not going to be making strong arguments about cause and effect unless you have a clearly observable pattern where anybody that comes in and looks at the data says, oh yeah, I can see they got better and then they got worse when you took it away. And then you don't really need to rely on all the fancy math and reliability stuff. Probability stuff. Okay, there are lots of different types of single participant designs. One we just talked about is a reversal design, A B design, right? A is your kind of baseline phase, right? And then B is whenever you've now done something to them, and then you take away the thing you were doing. So you go back to A, and then you give B back again, right? So we want to be able to show experimental control over the behavior. Right? And here's where you can really make that argument for cause and effect, even though you only have maybe one participant. Say, oh, gee, it's only one person. Are you sure that's why? Well, geez, what other explanation can you have that the DV changed exactly according to the pattern of the manipulation of our independent variable? This seems to be pretty good evidence that at least with this person, there was a cause and effect relationship between the independent variable that we were manipulating and the dependent variable that we were measuring. Another approach would be the phase change design, which is a slightly more complex design, and this is where it really comes to, I think, be helpful to real world application for clinicians, for counselors, where so you get a baseline, you do some treatment, which is B, and then instead of taking B away, because one of the big advantages of this of single-end designs is they can be very flexible. You can change what you're doing mid-study, right? You don't have to go back and oh geez, we got to get new questionnaires and redesign this apparatus. No, you just keep measuring. So you get a baseline, the kid's head banging a lot, we'll give the token economy, it doesn't change his behavior, right? We measure, still head banging a lot, so we're not going to take away the token economy. Maybe we say, geez, I think this token economy should work, but maybe, you know what, whenever he turns his tokens in, it's always for candy. Maybe instead of turning it in for candy, you can turn it in for time to play video games. So we're altering the treatment. So now we're going from B, original treatment, to B1. So not really taking B away, not going back to baseline. Just, okay, well, didn't see a change. Let's do something different. So you go to B1, and now we see the behavior come down. Awesome, they worked. Just to be sure that that's what worked and it wasn't some fluke or just maturation, we take that away. So we go back to A, and the head banging resumes. Now we've shown that, yep, okay, we need to do this token economy, and we need to do it where the tokens are turned in for time with video game. Right? So that's the phase change, which is just a slight variation. Component analysis can also be really helpful, also sometimes called a dismantling design. And this is typically used when you have some sort of multi-component treatment that you already know is effective, but you want to know if all the components are needed, right? And often this has to do with if there's this treatment that it really works when we do this, this, and this, but man, it's really expensive and time-consuming to provide all these different aspects of treatment. And it could be something as simple as, okay, for this addiction recovery, people they get their individual therapy and they do group. And geez, in this setting, individual and group, they always get better. Okay, great. So do you need both of those, or would just one suffice? So you do a component analysis where you start off and you give them the two things that work and say, okay, yeah, they're getting better, looks good. Let's take one thing away. So we take group therapy away. They only do individual. Okay, are they maintaining their gains? Are they continuing to gain? Are they going back up? And then we put the other piece back together, so you get the whole thing again. Okay, so let's say they're doing good when they got everything. We take one piece away, they start doing something not so good again. Ooh, okay, so we need the piece that was missing. We need that C, put it back in, B and C back together. Okay, they're doing good again, great. Now we take away B, just give them C. Now if they keep doing well, okay, well really, they just need C. They don't need both. But again, depending on what happens, you may go back and give the full complement of treatment back again. But again, it's just a way of taking a multi-component treatment and then taking away and putting back parts to figure out which part or parts are essential. So again, just a fancier version of the reversal design. Okay, here's where it actually gets a little bit different. The first three were all kind of different flavors of the same thing. But multiple baseline designs are a bit different, and and you often choose a multiple baseline design whenever reversal designs, as the first three really were, would be problematic for whatever reason. So different ways to do this. One would be you'd have multiple baselines across behaviors, right? So we want to show experimental control and that it's not just some random thing happening. So maybe with the kid that's headbanging, we're going to measure that, and the kid is also doing some other problematic behaviors that we're not targeting, right? So the kid's also maybe pushing other clients at a facility, or is maybe defecating in inappropriate places, whatever. So there's some other problematic behaviors, and we're going to measure all of them, and multiple times. So we're going to imagine these kind of separate graphs for each behavior you're looking at, and we get this baseline phase where, okay, all these behaviors are fairly stable. Okay, we're going to target this one. We're going to target the head banging with our token economy intervention, not target the others. And if what we're doing really does have a cause-effect relationship, then we should see the head banging behavior changes, but the other behaviors do not. If the other behaviors change, then we say, well, geez, maybe it wasn't what we did. Maybe the kid's just maturing. Maybe there's something else going on, some sort of history effect outside in the world that's causing this kid to do better overall, or worse overall, if that's what happens. Right? So you can measure multiple behaviors, again, targeting only one to see, and again, that doesn't sound very clinician friendly, but for the research purposes, you hope in this instance the only behavior that changes is the one you're targeting. Another way to do it would be multiple baselines across participants. And again, this is where you get to a little more comparing one individual to another. But you're not going to completely withhold treatment. But what you will do is you'll stagger the time at which different people get treatment. So let's say you have 3 kids all engaged in headbanging behavior. We'll start measuring them all on day 1. Day 2, day 3, we measure. On day 4, we begin the intervention with the first kid. Measure. Day 6 or 7, we begin the intervention with the second kid. Day 10, we begin the intervention with the third kid. And so we should see each kid changing only when we introduce the intervention. Right? If we see changes in all 3 kids at the same time, okay, well, something else happened in their world, and it wasn't what we did. But if we're watching them all at the same time, we can kind of rule out some sort of history effect, outside influence, because they only changed when we introduced this thing. Okay, so you can do it across participants. And the third way is, across situations. This may be when you're looking at the same behavior treated at different times in different situations. So maybe you have a client that has panic attacks. And they have them in a variety of places, usually being around people. And you have some intervention that's very specific, and you measure where they have panic attacks at the mall, and how many they have at work, how many they have when they go to some worship services, whatever it is. But then again, you target only one situation. Okay, we're going to go do some work at the mall, do some exposure stuff. You go to the mall with them. You don't do anything else. You measure all the other places, and you find, okay, once I started working with you, yep, panic attacks at the mall went down. Everywhere else, they didn't go down. Then I start the next situation. Okay, now let's do this treatment at work. Down. The other places, still not down. Okay, so you just, you're going to, instead of starting with people at different times, you're going to start with that same person in different situations. Again, showing experimental control over the behavior. Okay, so as kind of cool and flexible as these designs are, they do have some limitations. The most obvious of which, of course, is generalizability. When you've got a very small n, sometimes one person, people would very rightly say, well, okay, yeah, that worked with that client. Will it work with somebody different? It worked with that client when you had this exact type of token economy where it was every hour. What if it was every hour that they weren't headbanging, they got a token? What if it was every 30 minutes or every 2 hours? Or, what if what we do is anyway different than what you did? And that's a fair question. But again, if you want to some sort of starting point to show, hey, a token economy can work. This is great, and generalizability may not be your goal, right? Because it all depends on who you want to generalize to when you're doing the research. And if you want to show this that a treatment works for everybody, don't do a single in design. If you want to show that a treatment can work, or that it can work for a very particular group of people, then this very well may be an appropriate design. And again, not that hard to replicate a single in design. So do with this client. Okay, now I'm gonna do it with this client. Or I did with this client with an hour, where every hour that they were not engaging in a targeted behavior, they got a token. Now I'm going to do it again with another client where we extended it to every 2 hours. And it still worked. Okay, so wouldn't be that much work to do a replication. A bigger concern for all the designs that involve reversal components is sometimes you might wonder if the effects of the independent variable are reversible, right? So for very kind of behavioral things like token economies, yeah, generally, if I stop rewarding this thing, if I stop punishing this thing, the behavior will go back. But for things that you may do more in counseling, hopefully things may not be so reversible. Some things at least. You know, if I'm working with a client and I'm teaching them to identify cognitive distortions and to engage in positive self-talk, okay, once I stop teaching that client to engage in positive self-talk, hopefully they don't go back to where they were before just because I stopped teaching them that, because hopefully they've learned that and now their behavior will continue to be different. So sometimes the things we do with clients, we expect them to be fairly permanent and not so reversible. So they may not be lend themselves all that well to this type of design if the thing you're doing logically wouldn't withdrawing it wouldn't lead to reversal or a resurgence of symptoms. Another issue is there are some ethical concerns regarding reversal designs, ABA designs. You can say, well, geez, this kid finally stopped headbanging, and now you're going to take this thing away? Seriously? Is that ethical? Is that right? And again, you're not going to take it away for a month or a week. It may even be for one day or just until headbanging frequency increases again. And you say, even that, why would you want the kid to headbang at all? Well, if you've been struggling to find any intervention that will work with this kid at all, and you've found something you think might work, it's probably worth a little bit of harm to that client to be sure that this works, rather than say, okay, yeah, it works, fine, everybody goes away, and then a week later, it's no longer working because it didn't really work. Right? You want to be sure. Right? When you're directing the time and energy and resources to find an answer to the problem, you want some confidence that your answer is a correct one. But still, depending on what you're doing, taking things away may be unethical. And again, that's why the multiple baseline designs are sometimes preferred to reversal designs, if there are concerns about ethics and if there are concerns about the reversibility of the effect of the independent variable. Another thing to keep in mind is a key feature of these designs is multiple measurements, measuring the DV multiple times. And as we remember from our talks about threats to internal validity, measuring a DV multiple times has effects, right? There can be practice effects, fatigue effects, kind of expectancy effects, where there's these demand characteristics where, okay, they keep asking me about this, I guess I should say lower or higher, but definitely different because they keep asking the same thing. And so, in part, some of these limitations are why single end designs aren't in the same kind of category as experimental research. Another category, quasi-experimental research, is where you don't have all the features of an experiment, but you're still interested in cause and effect. And most commonly, the feature that's missing from a quasi-experimental design, where, geez, if they just had this, it would have been experimental. The thing that they're missing isn't manipulation of an independent variable. You're still manipulating an IV. What they're missing is random assignment. Right? So maybe you have two existing groups, or people have chosen what group they want to be in, but you still are doing something different to one than the other. It's not where something's already happened. Right? So that's where quasi-experimental research differs from causal comparative research, which is a type of correlational study, right? Where causal comparative is where you're interested in cause and effect, but the effect has already happened. So, you've got these a group of individuals who have broken some law, right? Another group of individuals who have not broken law. You want, geez, why did they break the law and they didn't? So you get those two groups and you ask them about their past, right? Or you ask them about their family, if their mother's breastfed, or whatever you think caused them to break the law. But they've already broken the law. That thing's already happened. So whatever thing you're asking about, their family dynamics, if they got pushed down on the playground, already happened. You're not manipulating it. That's a correlational study. If you are manipulating, you are going to do something different to one group than the other. That goes a little more internal validity than a correlational study. Gets closer to an experiment, but if you didn't randomly assign people to one group or the other, not quite there. So it's quasi-experimental. Most commonly used types would be your non-equivalent control group design, right, where you have two groups do something to one different than the other and measure post-test only, or improving upon that would be the non-equivalent control group pre-test post-test design. Two existing groups, measure them both pre, do something differently to one than the other, measure them again. And then there's the time series designs, which I won't talk too much about, but a lot like a single in design, but just where you're looking at the group level, but doing multiple measurements to establish some sort of pattern, and then boom, we're going to do an intervention and see if the pattern changes. Okay, in terms of threats to internal validity in quasi-experimental research, one of the main things you've got to worry about is if you didn't use random assignment, how can you establish equivalence, right? Because that's the whole thing that random assignment is supposed to do, is establish roughly equivalent groups, which again is more likely to happen when we have larger groups. But if we didn't use random assignment at all, then how are we going to know the groups aren't already different before we do something to them? Well, the most simplest way would be to measure the two groups in ways that you think might be important. And this doesn't necessarily have to be before you do something to them. So you could do it after. So you manipulate a variable, and then you're going to ask the groups, okay, how old are you? What's your socioeconomic status? All the demographic stuff, because what you do to them isn't going to change that. Isn't going to change the subject variable. And you can show, okay, yeah, this group on average was the same age as this group, and they had roughly the same percentage of SES in each group, and all these things. Right? Or you could measure before you do the IV on the dependent variable, and you could do it with an eye to looking at change, or you could simply do it and say, before we did anything, measure both groups, and they were both equally depressed. Now we're going to go do our study. If you want to get a bit fancier, you could use a matching approach, right? Where you've got these groups, or maybe potential groups. It gives two kind of big pools of potential subjects that you have access to, and you can measure a bunch of variables you're interested in, maybe age, gender, ethnicity, SES, education level, whatever, maybe even the dependent variable. And then you could find matches where, okay, somebody in pool A and somebody in pool B, they're pretty similar on these variables. Okay, so I'm going to select each one of you to be in the study, right? And pool A is going to be in group A because maybe they're at treatment facility A, and pool B is at treatment facility B. So I didn't get to assign you to be in A or B. You're already in A or B, but I can decide whether or not you're going to be in my study. And I select you to be in my study if you've got somebody I can match you with. And then I continue matching, pulling in matched pairs till I build two groups that pretty much look very similar to each other. And then I have the choice of looking at my pairs, doing a very kind of matched pairs design, comparing one person to the other to their matched pair, and I'll use kind of within subjects types of analyses when I do that, right? paired groups, t-test types of things. Or I could simply create the groups with that match design and say, okay, I'm not going to look at pairs. I'm just going to look at the groups, but I'm confident that I've established fairly equivalent groups via my match pairs approach to building my samples. Another thing you can do is be sure and have at least one within subjects factor, right, where you're comparing participants to themselves rather than to each other. And this can be when you have if you're doing a pre-post design, right, and you're manipulating a variable, that's an experiment. So this is really only whenever you have that non-equivalent control group pre-post design where you have two groups, you didn't assign them, they're existing, but you're able to measure them pre, do something to one, measure them both post. Okay, then at least in some ways you're able to look at change within an individual, so that you have at least one within subjects factor, which helps with that problem of non-equivalent groups. Another strategy in terms of selection would be a thing not to do, not to use extreme scores as inclusion criteria. So when you're deciding who can be in the study, you say, well, geez, I'm looking to study depression, so only people who score above 70T on the depression scale of the PAI can be in the study. Well, if you do that, if you only have people that are high, some of them will be high on that measure that day, and their true score is actually lower than that, and they're going to regress down toward the mean. So don't do that. And then in general, just whenever you're doing a quasi-experimental design, you want to exert as much experimental control as you can in all other areas. So I'm going to treat the two groups as similarly as possible. And again, sometimes your experimental control is limited by the powers that be. If I'm looking at two different treatment facilities and I want to say, okay, everything is exactly the same, but one facility says, no, we eat breakfast at 8, the other one says, no, we eat breakfast at 9, okay, maybe you can't change that. But everything that you can control, you try to control to keep the groups being treated, their experiences being as similar as possible, other than the independent variable. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about is just a little bit about clinical outcome research. Because the designs we've talked about are often used to evaluate treatments. So there's a couple of terms and then a couple of ideas related specifically to clinical outcome research I wanted to be sure and touch on in this lecture. One of those would be efficacy research versus effectiveness research. And those are two different, they seem like synonyms, I know, but they're two very different types of, well, not very, but they're two different types of research. One, efficacy research asks, can a treatment work? So if I've developed this protocol to do group therapy this way, can it result in a reduction in depressive symptoms? Effectiveness research says, well, does it work in the real world? And the answer to those questions can be different, where yeah, it can work, but no, it doesn't work in the real world, right? So maybe I did a study where I selected people to be in my my study, looking at the efficacy of this group therapy procedure, and for depression, and I selected participants with exclusion criteria saying you couldn't have any comorbid diagnoses, no anxiety disorder, no substance use, all these things. And then I trained the group therapists repeatedly before the study began to make sure they all did things the exact same way. They followed this manual where group 1, these things happen, session 1, session 2, session 3, session 4, all the way through maybe 8 sessions, where there was a very fairly rigid protocol for what needed to happen. Okay, and I measured to make sure that they did what I said they were going to do. So I measured treatment fidelity. Yep, they all did exactly what they're supposed to do, and yep, people got better. Great. They said, gee, hey, this therapy works. I've done it. And then I sell the manual to hospitals, and they say, oh, this is great. And they hand their manuals out to whoever's doing their groups, maybe clinical social workers, maybe some interns getting their hours for the LPCs, maybe some psychologists, maybe some LPCs, maybe some, all different types of people, all with different levels of experience doing group therapy, none of which are going to be nearly as worried about being adherent and faithful to every little step of that manual as the people in that study were. Right? And their participants aren't going to be screened more than likely such that they only have major depressive disorder with no other comorbid diagnoses. So then we say, okay, when that happens, those people in those groups getting that treatment get better. Maybe, maybe not. Right? So the answer to the effectiveness question can be different to the efficacy question. And you say, well, geez, effectiveness seems like the thing that's really most important. Why even worry about that efficacy? Why waste time with that? Let's just see if it works. Well, you're talking about, again, a different focus where you have efficacy studies with a focus on internal validity and effectiveness focused on external validity. And one thing that we know is it doesn't make any sense to worry about external validity until you've established internal validity. Right? So why would I go out and say, okay, I'm going to do this study with this kind of hodgepodge group with minimal training and see if it works? Because then if it doesn't work, it's, yeah, it didn't work, no point doing it. Well, there's a whole lot of reasons you may not have found an effect. Right? With very little experimental control, didn't worry about internal validity at all. All you worried about was, hey, it's a very real setting. But when you find that it doesn't work, are you really confident that it won't work for anybody else? Maybe it was unique to that group. Or on the flip side, it does work. Hey, great, it worked in the real world. Well, maybe just for that group. Maybe you had a really dynamic person doing the therapy. Right? You don't know because you didn't have the experimental control. So it is important to establish efficacy first, in my opinion, and then, okay, we know it can work. Let's see if it will work. And then it may need to be tweaked to become effective in the real world. So there should be this kind of interplay between efficacy research and effectiveness research, and that goes back to that clinician-researcher divide where clinicians need to be giving feedback to researchers. Say, gee, I read your study about doing this thing. When I did it, it didn't work. Here's why. I couldn't do this. The people were like this. Whatever it is, we need to develop that that language, and that's one more reason why you should be learning stuff in this class, is so that you'll have the language you need when talking to researchers to tell them, hey, I need you to study it like this. My clients aren't like that, or I'm not going to get 17 weeks to do this. You know, their insurance company is going to give me 8. Tell me if you can find a way to make this work in the lab in 8 weeks, and then I'll try it again. Right? So both types of research, very important, but in my opinion, efficacy should be established first, and then the emphasis should shift to effectiveness. Parallel to the idea of establish internal validity first, and then we replicate a study to establish external validity. Another issue in clinical outcome research is what you should do in terms of your comparison group. You know, you use a control group, meaning a group that doesn't get any treatment. There's some ethical concerns about that. And then if you're going to be doing an experiment with random assignment, hey, you want to be in this study? You're either going to get in the group that gets therapy or a group that gets nothing, where we just sit and look at you in a room. Yeah, I'll be in that study. Okay, whoever agrees to be in that study where they could potentially be in a control group, that's probably not going to be like your typical client. So you're going to start off with some significant external validity problems at the beginning, which again, we don't want to focus only on external validity, but we don't want to throw out the possibility of any external validity at the outset. So there are some problems with using control groups in clinical studies, outcome studies. And so more frequently you'll see, if there's going to be kind of a control group type thing, it'll be a wait list control. Which again, still, you may have to wait 2 weeks. Some more people may say, no, my problem is too severe, I can't wait. But at least more people will probably sign up for that. That'll be like real clients, people that are willing to be in some sort of placebo group, right? But probably even better than a control group would be a comparison group, both for methodological reasons and also for ethical reasons. if you want to see if some treatment works, typically our choice isn't, hey, does this work better than nothing? Really the choice is, does this work better than the standard of care they would get otherwise? So that's what should be in your comparison group. So if I'm going to go into some setting, some hospital, some prison, wherever, and offer some sort of new treatment, I want to see if it works. Okay, what are they getting now? So I'm going to compare my treatment group. My comparison group is going to be treatment as expected, as typical, right? And then I'm not depriving them of services. They're just getting whatever services they would regularly get. Somebody else is getting something extra. And you might find, smaller effect sizes, smaller differences, but you'll sleep better at night. Last thing to think about with clinical outcome research is, what outcome do you measure? And there's one where, unfortunately, I don't really have an answer for you. I just think it's a question you need to think about for your own research and when evaluating research. When somebody says, hey, this treatment works, what do you mean it works? Works how? What does it do? Right? So does it lead to symptom reduction? And is that the ultimate goal? Right? So a kid that's being oppositional, you have the treatment that, okay, yeah, they'll be way less oppositional, they'll be very compliant, they'll always say yes sir, yes ma'am, be very polite and respectful. Hey, that's wonderful. What's the treatment? Oh, well, there's this cattle prod and you shock them. That sounds horrible, right? And the kid is compliant out of fear. Okay, well, the non-compliance, the optional behavior decreased, therefore the treatment worked. Yeah, but is that really the goal you want? Even with things like sometimes working with people who have psychosis. If you have a treatment that involves kind of aversive consequences for their symptoms, they'll learn to report less symptoms. They won't have less symptoms, but they'll report them less. And again, is that the goal? Did it work? Because now they're hiding it. Even your clients that are suffering from things like depression and anxiety, maybe they'll report it less. Partly because they want to please you, they want to please the experimenter, they want to see themselves as being healthier. Are they really healthier? So sometimes so for depression, maybe the outcome shouldn't be, are you less depressed? Maybe it should be, are you happier? Are you more engaged with the world? Are you more connected to people? I don't know, but you got to think beyond simple symptom reduction, I believe, and when you're trying to decide what the outcome should be to show that something is efficacious and or effective. So when you're reading studies and you say, oh, this therapy works, pay very close attention to how they measure the dependent variable. What's the operational definition? What does it mean to work? Okay. That's all for now. Take care.